Good morning and welcome to the SCIFI Smart Cities Innovation Framework Implementation webinar on GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, Risk and Data Protection Impact Assessments. Welcome everybody. Just to let you know, this session is being recorded and will be available on the SCIFI YouTube channel. So a little bit about me, your speaker today. My name is Johanna Walker. I work for the University of Southampton, which is a knowledge partner in the SCIFI consortium. My PhD is in open innovation with open data, which is of course at the heart of what we do in SCIFI. And I also work on data sharing and research data trust, which is a format for legal and responsible data sharing. A paper that I recently wrote that you may be interested in reading if you are wanting to follow this up further is a paper in the online journal Data and Policy. It's called Data Protection by Design, Building the Foundations of Trustworthy Data Sharing, and we'll be talking more about data protection by design this morning. My co-authors are Professor Stella Bordelon, Geffian Thurmer, me, and Laura Carmichael, if you want to find that. So going to the next slide, I'm just going to briefly discuss what we're going to cover this morning. We're going to talk first about the GDPR and risk, because those two are important factors. Risk is an important factor in understanding how the GDPR is meant to apply. We're going to look at what actually constitutes personal data, because it's a slippery concept to pin down. We're going to look at data protection by design as a way of ensuring that we are compliant with the GDPR and that we are respectfully processing personal data. And then we're going to look at data protection impact assessments, what they are, why they're needed, when they're needed, how to carry them out. So moving on, the first thing, as I said, we're going to talk about is the GDPR. It's a risk-based approach. And I'm sure you've all heard this phrase before, but what does it actually mean? There is no explicit definition of risk in the GDPR, but it focuses on risks to individual data subjects' interests. It also differentiates between levels of risk, as certain things must be undertaken such as data protection impact assessments, where there is high risk. Happily, there's quite clear guidance on what kind of processing activities are high risk. But a useful working definition of risk for us is the likelihood of adverse event times the potential for harm to the individual. So to unpack that, it's very, very unlikely I'll get hit by a bus while working from home. That even though the potential for harm is great, we don't need to worry about it too much. And while it's quite likely that I'll drop crumbs down myself while eating a croissant on a Zoom call, the potential for harm is very, very small, conversely. And we'll come back to how this is relevant when looking at examples later. I'll be referring through this talk to various articles and recitals of the GDPR. In case you're not familiar, articles of the GDPR constitute the legal requirements and recitals provide the context and additional information. So we can discover from recital 75 that the GDPR takes a risk-based approach and what those risks are. So in recital 75, it says that risks can be physical, material, or non-material damage. And non-material damage is things like pain, fear, distress, anguish, anxiety, injury to feelings, affront to dignity, suffering from the death of a loved one, even loss of enjoyment or loss of future wages. So it doesn't affect you materially now, but it might affect you in the future. Obvious risks include things like discrimination and identity fraud, the possibility of those taking place. But any other significant economic or social disadvantage is also included as a risk. And recital 76 tells us that risk should be evaluated on the basis of an objective assessment. And the data controller, the person in charge of data processing in a company, must take the potential for risks to the data subject into consideration when selecting what can be processed and how. So this is the risk approach. Some local regulatory authorities, supervisory authorities, have more no risk approaches, and that is a conflict. We don't need to worry about that now. It's more for kind of lawyers to worry about. But I just want to kind of give that idea that there are alternatives. There is a risk-based approach, there is a no-risk approach, and the GDPR is a no-risk approach. Sorry, is a risk-based approach. So moving on to the next slide, we can look at data that presents risks. And we all know that the GDPR is relevant to personal data. It was in fact created not to be obstructive or problematic, but to enable the free flow of data. You can also read the relevant regulations on the free flow of non-personal data if you wish, but we're not talking about that today. We're also mostly not talking about sensitive data, which requires different conditions to be met for processing. Very briefly, because we will be talking about them later. In the context of high risk. So personal data that reveals racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, or trade union membership is all sensitive data. It's in a special category. Personal data, which is genetic data, biometric data, health data, or data to do with your sex life or sexual orientation, is also separate from the general category of personal data. However, sadly, we cannot simply pick up a piece of data and say with confidence, yes, this is non-personal data, and so 2018/1807, that's the relevant regulations on the free flow of non-personal data applies. Whether something is personal data is based not only on what it is, but on its context and its purpose. And of course, even personal data can theoretically be depersonalized via anonymization. And on top of this slight potential for confusion about whether something is personal data because of its context and purpose, there is an even more nebulous layer, which is arguments such as, given sufficient effort, much non-personal data can be rendered personal, and given sufficient effort, anonymized data can be re-identified. So depersonalized data is anonymized data. In principle, it is outside the GDPR, but because of contextuality, you need to be careful. To put it another way, by using anonymized data in certain contexts and for certain purposes, you can still make it personal data. And we'll come to examples of those contexts and purposes in a minute. When using anonymized data, account must be taken all the means reasonably likely, those are the words, to be used to identify people. And here's an example of the no-risk approach. The French regulator, CNIL, states re-identification must be practically impossible, and that shows you they have a no-risk approach rather than a risk-based approach. But one way of taking into account the reasonable likelihood of, or not, of re-identifying anonymized data is ensuring you're using the most up-to-date anonymization techniques. So non-personal data, whether depersonalized or never apparently personal, can also become personal via context and purpose. And so we're going to, on the next slide, we're going to look at those. And I've given quite a lot of detail on this slide because the examples can sometimes be hard to really wrap your head round, but here's a couple. And these are both taken from the UK Information Commissioner's Office, but they will be relevant across Europe. So here's an example. A company uses call logs from a desk phone to help identify when the person who sits at that desk was in the office. So this is really just about when the phone is used. And data about a telephone in use is not necessarily information relating to an individual in its own right. However, when it's associated with the individual who is allocated that desk and used to assess performance of that individual, the telephone use data is personal data. So those log files will become personal data. And a really good example that people often use is information about the market value of a particular house. And we all see these on websites such as Zoopla or Rightmove or the appropriate property website in your area. And they will give you information about house values, and data about a 4-bedroom detached house in a medium-sized town is not necessarily related to an individual. However, when that data is then linked to a particular individual, for instance, to find out where they live, to identify their address, or used in considerations of the amount of electricity that is used to determine the bill that the individual is required to pay, then that data about the house becomes personal data. So I hope you can see that there is no specific way of saying this is or isn't personal data. It's all about what it is being used for. And so that really has to be taken into consideration. And then our next slide, in our next slide, we can see that we're going to look at pseudonymized data, which is not the same as anonymized data, and it is its own special category of personalized data. So it's data that's processed in such a way that data can only be attributed to a data subject with the aid of additional information. And in the GDPR, it's explicitly encouraged as a risk management measure. It's not anonymization, it doesn't make the subject completely unidentifiable. It merely reduces the linkability of a data set with the original identity of a data subject. And you can see that if we go to that previous discussion about how we might have made those log files on that phone calls personal data, pseudonymization could really help reduce the linkability here. And so it's a useful security measure. Pseudonymous data is still explicitly personal data, but its processing is seen as presenting less risk to data subjects. And as such, it's given certain privileges which are designed to incentivize its use. Okay, moving on now to slide 8. And we're going to talk about data protection by design. Data protection by design is going to enable us to adopt a risk-based approach. We need to put in place appropriate technical and organizational measures which do two things. Firstly, they implement the data protection principles effectively. And secondly, they protect the rights of data subjects by integrating necessary safeguards. Obviously, these measures can be preventative or mitigate issues. It's probably best to have as many in place as possible prevention before there is a problem. And so just the relevant articles here, just in case you want to follow them up. Article 5 is data protection principles, and Articles 12 to 22 are data subject rights. So here we have the data protection principles, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And for each of these principles, when you're undertaking data protection by design, you need to put in place controls that implement the principles. And these controls are up to you to decide. There is not one set of things you have to do to implement them. This is because, of course, of context. You need to create a balance between privacy and utility. I'll talk a little bit about these controls, but for more detail, I do recommend you look at the SCIFI webinar, Foundations of a Risk-Based Approach to Data Protections, published on the 30th of April 2019 at about 20 minutes, 1940. This'll go through applying which controls might be applied to each of these principles. I really, really recommend you go and look at that if you're interested in having more ideas about examples. So, for instance, to ensure accuracy, you may want to have mechanisms in place for cross-checking attributes. Transparency may include keeping accessible log files of processing. Accountability may include having a clear method for data subjects accessing their own information. And confidentiality obviously means having the right security measures in place. Now, controls are iterative, and they may change because of technical or social change, or be driven by business change that requires new controls. Data protection measures should be implemented at each stage of the data-driven innovation project, at conception, during development, and at deployment. For instance, at conception, you may want to document your objectives, demonstrating how this will be lawful, fair, and transparent, and define the time frame which will address your storage limitations or other limitation. The previous webinar I referred to also has information on how to scale data protection controls, which is incredibly important. when looking at at data that's being managed, big data, that's especially sensor data. So now we're going to come on to the next part, which is data protection impact assessments. So we all, if we are processing personal data, need to ensure we have implemented the appropriate data protection controls, as I just described. And the first step is, and then looking at data protection impact assessments, they have 4 steps. And their first step is, are we processing personal data? And I hope you've kind of come to the idea that, in fact, it is more likely that you are processing personal data than not, especially if you take into account the fact that we are often trying to do something that presents people with an option or a choice, or a group of people with information about the patterns of other people's behavior. We should always, I think, can I definitely exclude the fact that I am processing personal data before I assume that I'm not processing personal data? So the first step of a data protection impact assessment is to think about, are we processing personal data? And that's probably. Second step is, have we implemented appropriate steps that address each of the data protection principles at every point in our data-driven innovation process? Well, hopefully. And the third step is, do we need a data protection impact assessment? And if so, how do we do it? And that's what we'll look at now. So Article 35 of the GDPR states that if there is a high risk to natural persons, the controller shall carry out an impact assessment of the process. And this can sound quite intimidating. What, for instance, constitutes high risk? How can we carry out the assessment? But in fact, there is plenty of guidance. Article 35 tells us that the DPIA is in particular required where there is systematic evaluation of personal aspects, such as profiling, based on automated process decisions that produce legal effects, or something such as denial service, if I'm choosing who is going to be my customer based on automatic process decisions. Where special category data is processed, so we've discussed those protected characteristics, and where systematic monitoring of public areas is involved, which I know several of the SCIFI pilots are doing. So this can include CCTV, but it is not limited to CCTV. It includes any systematic monitoring. Article 35 does define what the assessment should contain in 4 steps. So the steps aren't necessarily in the order that it's most useful for us to carry out, but we can come back to that. National regulators are very helpful here. They often give guidance on this. They may also call them a privacy impact assessment. And remember, like data protection by design, these are iterative. So this slide shows the 4 steps of a data protection impact assessment. We can actually break this down into a simple process which doesn't quite follow the same order as Article 35, but in practice we don't know what the necessity and proportionality is until we know what the risks and measures are. So first we describe our operations and process, and purpose rather. Then we assess the risks. Dependent on these risks, we select appropriate controls. And finally, we can assess whether there are effective alternatives. So let's take step 1. We need to describe our operations and purpose. This description can be as simple as a Word doc, but is more often a data flow diagram that explains what the data sources are. These are external entities, where the data is kept, the data stores, the movements of data within and outside the organization, the data flows, and how those engage with one another, which is the data processors. So here you can see, and it quite small, but it doesn't really matter about the detail, example of a data flow diagram that describes the envisaged processing operations and purpose. There is both no one right way to do a data flow diagram, and there are also many, many versions of how to do it. So choose one for yourself that works for you. But the basic key to these is one shape for the external entities, which here you can see as the reddish pink squares. One shape for processors, which here you can see as the green round-ended boxes. One for stores, which is showing up as the kind of teal-coloured long rectangular box, and the arrows are always used for flows. And completing a data flow diagram may be useful for other purposes in your organisation. You may, in fact, already have one. Once you've completed one of these, which gives you an understanding of what data you've got, where you're processing it, why you're processing it, where you're keeping it, then and how it moves around your organisation, then go to step 3 of the data impact assessment. And step 3 covers the assessment of risks to rights and freedoms of data subjects. And this is the most vague area in the actual GDPR. The possible risks are enhanced when big data processing, machine learning, AI, etc. are applied. We've looked at recital 75 and generally how risk is defined. Happily, the national regulators, the supervisory authorities, can help us here. Each national regulator will have a list of possible events that will create high-risk situations. They do differ, so do please check, but they all comply with the 9 or include the 9 that are shown on the screen here. And so if you are looking at, if you are processing data that includes vulnerable data subjects such as children, if, as already mentioned, the processing can lead to denial of service or involves automated decision making with legal effect, because one of the rights is that all legal decision making should be made by people, should have human involvement, not just done automated. If it involves systematic monitoring, people also, as I said, usually consider this to mean CCTV, but in fact involves any systematic monitoring of public spaces using any form of, even if you're not monitoring people, even if you're monitoring cars or traffic, it's still relevant here to consider what effect this has on personal data, whether anything is created that is personal data or it creates a personal data context or purpose. So anything that involves evaluation or scoring, anything that involves large scale data processing. So almost all big data driven innovation projects are going to have to consider this, as well as the fact you can see the next line is if there is an innovative use, you need to do a DPIA. If there is sensitive data, obviously, which we've already talked about, the special category data, and if you are matching or combining data sets, because of course this leads to higher re-identification risk. Any of these 9 situations increases risk. Now, if you have one of these situations, if you're carrying out one of these processes or using one type of this data, you should is the word, do a data impact assessment, as it is good practice. But if you have 2, you must do one according to Article 35. But please, again, check with your local regulator, because they may require you to do a data protection impact assessment, even if you only meet one of the criteria. And remember, when you're assessing the risk, to quantify the event or harm. And you'll remember earlier I was discussing the likelihood of my getting hit by a bus, or while I was working from home, or dropping crumbs down myself, and what the potential is for the harm. Of course, when I drop the crumbs down myself, that could involve no harm, minimal harm, significant harm, or maximum harm. I'm thinking let's go for no harm. And obviously, if I'm hit by a bus, it might be maximum harm. But again, that's one side of the scale, and the other side of the scale is the likelihood of it happening. Okay, now the next step, sorry, which is actually the 4th step of a data protection impact assessment, but the next one we would carry out is implementing the measures to address the risks. Now, happily, you already underwent the data protection by design methodology, and all your measures, technical and social, are in place. The best practice is, of course, that at least one control is in place for each potential hazard. There might be many hazards associated with one item. For instance, vulnerable data subjects, there's a lot of potentials for harm there. Now, again, if you want to look more into how you can scale your controls, I strongly recommend looking at another webinar from last year, which goes into this in more detail at the end, around the 20-minute point. So this is data protection impact assessments for data analytics and sharing in the SCIFI channel. And there is a lot more detail there on scaling up, which we're not going to go into here. And so the last part of the data protection impact assessment is going back to step 2, which is assessment of necessity and proportionality of measures to purpose. This step where we say, okay, this is what I'm doing. I've now decided what potential risk is created by these potential adverse events and the level of harm. I have put my controls in place and I know what I'm doing with this data. But is this the only way to manage this? Could I do it with different data? Could I produce the same effect in the end with different data? Could I change my processes so they are slightly safer? Maybe I keep, instead of combining these data sets, I can in fact link them in a different way, perhaps pseudonymously. What are the alternatives to my processes? And how could I put them in place? And are these alternatives going to be less deleterious to privacy? In other words, could there be alternative practices that are more appropriate? And this is a very useful exercise to do, regardless. Is there another way you could do what you're doing, which in the end is more compliant with the GDPR and works, touches on personal data in less potentially risky ways, whether it's because it's just a different kind of personal data, whether it's been pseudonymized, which, as we've seen, the GDPR considers to reduce risk, whether it's because you've changed the context or the purpose, or whether it's because you've realized that you could, for instance, remove again, adhering to the principle here of data minimization, whether you could remove some of the data from your data sets and make it give there less data relating to individual data subjects and still do what you want to do. So again, that's a general overview of doing a data impact assessment. And as you can see, you don't actually need to you could do your own one. You don't need to use somebody else's format. That's enough guidance. However, I do recommend checking with your national regulator, mainly because they have, and if we could just, I wonder, skip back to slide 10, we can see that the national regulators do have extensive methodologies. So such as the Information Commissioner's Office, CNIL, and the Standard Data Protection Model, which is a kind of federal German model, which I understand has now got a second version. These are all models that you can that already exist, that it's probably, you know, using those will not only mean that you don't need to kind of, you know, use your own imagination for any of it, but it will also mean that you're compliant with aspects of the GDPR and doing compliant with aspects of DPIAs that are important for one supervisory authority and maybe less for another. So, for instance, whether your supervisory authority requires you to do a DPIA for if you only meet one of the criteria of the 9 different criteria for high risk. So I would recommend finding your local supervisory authority and finding the methodology that they suggest. And the other point that came up in data protection by design is important in DPI, in running an assessment, is they are iterative. You can't just do one once and that's it. Technologies change, processes change, the social aspects, maybe how data is being collected, legal aspects are all going to change. And so it's really important that you iterate on your impact assessment. How often you need to iterate is obviously completely dependent on how often you're changing your processes, how often you change what data you're collecting, any changes to the environment about where the data is collected or how it is collected will impact on this. Any additional data sets, but this is something that really bears coming back and reviewing, because again, this is about risk and risk changes. So it's a really important factor to come back to. And I think that really covers everything that I wanted to talk about this morning. I just wanted to give you this overview really of the kind of nebulous nature of personal data, how we do have this lovely, very thorough regulation on it, but we can only really decide what is personal data when we're using it. I mean, obviously not special categories data, but something that may not be immediately personal data can become personal data. So we have to think about it in the context of its use and purpose. How data protection by design can be used to match up the steps that you take with the data protection, with the 7 data protection principles, to make sure that each of those is being addressed thoroughly. And then finally, how a data protection impact assessment can be carried out and your main considerations in undertaking those.